My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowsky Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. If there ever was an election that should serve as a wake-up call, this month's results returning Donald Trump to the White House provided just that. For New Yorkers, a city of immigrants, a city of diverse needs, and clearly a city out of touch with a national electorate that rejected so-called appeals to diversity and inclusion, the question is, are we waking up to a nightmare that will forever change our nation and our city for far longer and in more dramatic ways than we could yet understand? We're here to talk with four New Yorkers about what happened and what it means. Harry Siegel is an editor at thecity.nyc, which if you do not read on a regular basis, you should, and a columnist for the Daily News, among other places. Samir Sonti is an assistant professor of urban policy at CUNY's School of Labor and Urban Studies. Jaime Estades is a professor at the Columbia School of Social Work and the former head of the Latino Leadership Institute at Hunter College. Sarah Steiner is a veteran election lawyer. Let me start with you, Harry. You and I are political experts. We've been around. What the hell happened?
First off, this was it for political experts and for a press that's been covering Donald Trump one way for a decade now. And the country, at the end of that cycle, has produced a really different verdict. We had 3 consecutive election cycles in 2018, 2020, and 2022, where this guy was just barely enough. And after 4 years of Joe Biden, after the bizarreness of the first debate, and and then the installation of a new candidate, assassination attempt, all that, this was a clear verdict nationally. And by the way, in New York, which is where I live and what I care about, right? Like we were out of sync with the national mood. Almost 70% of the vote was for Kamala, but that was a really big drop off from Biden, and it was not mostly lots and lots of new Trump voters. Looks like there were a few under 100,000 new Trump voters, and there were 600,000 fewer voters for Kamala than for Joe Biden 4 years earlier. And there may be a number of reasons for that. I'd argue that a not vastly successful term, where dissatisfaction among Americans for a number of things, starting with the economy, fairly or not, but just how it was perceived, was pretty high, and insisting that wasn't the case when that was not how people were feeling about their own lives, just from polling and everything else should have made that very clear. The last thing I'll say here is there was lots of polling that this was anyone's race, and anyone I talked to, I said, well, who are you voting for? They'd say, whatever. Generally in New York, Kamala, who do you think is going to win? Who do you think your neighbor's voting for? There was like an awful lot of Trump there. And that turned out to be a real signal. There was a guy in France who bet a lot of money on Trump, and is this a conspiracy? Peter Thiel runs this market, and so on. He turns out to be a guy who'd had the same instinct, had the money, then commissioned his own polling. Who do you think your neighbor's voting for? And said, I think I can win a lot of money. And it turns out he did. So it's a humbling moment.
I like his name, by the way, so I'd like him to, take care of me. Let me, Sarah, he talked about conspiracies. He talked about the drop-off in the vote. In New York, oddly enough, 2 years ago, there was a Republican sweep. There was a Democratic sweep congressionally, and New York elected 3 Republicans, threw out 3 Democrats. This time, Trump, the Trump tide raised, and Democrats threw out 3 Republicans in Congress. So we went the other way. But the idea that elections are stolen, you have this bizarre situation where people think that they stole Senate elections, but somehow they didn't think to steal the presidential election. And we have the Electoral College. This is the first time since 2004 that a Republican has gotten more votes than a Democrat. What's the state of our elections?
Depends on who you ask. The conspiracy theories that are out there suddenly all went away when Trump won. All of a sudden, there wasn't a fixed election anymore. The It always confused me last time how there could be a fixed election only for the presidency, but every ballot was okay for the state and the local people in the same piece of paper that they had. But the people are not into voting. They don't think it's important anymore. They think that whatever happens in the government happens despite the way they vote, not because of how they vote. So I think that that's part of what the state of the elections are. I also think that there were a lot of people who viewed this as like teams and a game, who wins. And I think a lot of the people who are on the winning side here, they don't really understand what they voted for. They just won the game.
James Carville, very famously in 1992 in the Clinton election, said it's the economy, stupid. And that's what drove Clinton to knock out George H.W. Bush. Bernie Sanders, who you worked for, who went to Brooklyn College for his first year of college, let me put in a plug, has been talking about how Democrats don't know how to talk to working class voters. Is he right?
Well, I'll start by saying, to echo what Harry began with, that it's early. We still don't have a complete count of the vote, but what Harry documented in New York appears to hold nationwide, right? Trump more or less held steady. He might have gained in a few communities here and there, but generally held steady, and the election went the way it did because Harris and the Democrats lost a lot of votes. People didn't turn out. The question of why people weren't inspired to come out for the Harris campaign right now, I think, is one that Democratic strategists will probably be litigating for a long time. When we bring the economic lens to it, a analysis I suspect we're going to hear, and again, I should say anyone who says that they know what happened at this stage is kidding you, but I suspect what we'll hear Democratic strategists puzzling over the next months and probably years is a dissonance between what they perceive as the economic reality, which is a low unemployment rate, which is relatively decent wage growth in spite of inflation over the last 4 years, and which is arguably the most successful domestic economic policy record from an administration since either Johnson or Roosevelt, depending on how you measure it. So how, given that, did so few people feel inspired to come out? And that's going to be a puzzle that Democratic strategists will be scratching their heads about for some time. I think, and I don't speak for Senator Sanders, but I think he's onto something here, where the conclusion at this stage that I think Dems ought to be drawing is more or less the same one that we should have drawn in 2016, which is that a generation of abandonment of working class communities, from trade policy to welfare policy to union rights, can't be won back in 2 or 4 years. Despite the best efforts of the Biden administration, they were trying to claw themselves out of a grave that they dug themselves over 30 or 40 years, and it was simply too little too late.
I could argue that it was less an economic election than it was a cultural election. And that the arguments, I agree with Samir said, in terms of the economic record of the Biden administration, should have merited support from working people. But the appeal against immigrants, the appeal of the other, that these people, are eating dogs in Springfield, Ohio, it worked even among Latinos. I mean, one of the most shocking results to me is the vast drop-off in Latino votes for a Democratic ticket. What happened?
Well, I think messaging is extremely important in political campaigns. And you usually target the message for different groups. I don't think that they developed a message for the Latino community in the United States that it was clear. Something that is important, and just following his point, is the issue of working class. Most Latinos are working class in the United States. So you combine both, being Latino, being of whatever, black, whatever, but working class. The unions basically went with Obama. I mean, sorry, with Kamala. The unions are complaining now that the Kamala campaign didn't reach out to working people, that they depended on the unions to basically do the whole mobilization without Kamala coming, or the Kamala campaign coming and also talking to the workers. That's one. Second, the issue of Biden. Biden kept talking about that this is the best economy in the last 30, 35 years. And it was contradicting the Kamala campaign message that, that we want to increase salaries and we need to do things better for workers in general, but she didn't reach out. And that was a contradiction that people of all classes and races could see. They didn't have a good message. In terms of Latinos, the only time that the campaign was really acting like a campaign in terms of Latinos was after the insult of Puerto Ricans in Madison Square Garden. And then it became that. It was an insult. It had nothing to do with policy, had nothing to do, it was a racist attack, etc. So I have done campaigns in Allentown, in Reading. So the key, obviously, is Pennsylvania, always is Pennsylvania in every presidential election. So you needed the 500,000 Puerto Ricans that were in Pennsylvania. Then you have, for the first time, she goes to Pennsylvania and talks to Latinos because of the insult. Many Latinos were asking,
where were you?
Where were you? And in terms of a campaign, when you have a message, you always have to make sure that the message that you have for one particular group to pull out the vote doesn't pull out the other side's vote. When Kamala went 3 weeks before the election to Allentown and had that big rally, I have been there. All that is white. Besides Allen, all that is white. What you did, which is elections campaigning 101, don't make your campaign message a message for the opposition to come out. Because what they saw was, we are being ignored. They're talking about these people that we don't like. Now they're going to decide this election. And to me, that was a pull-out operation by the Kamala campaign of the white vote without knowing consciously that that's what they were doing.
I would argue that whether it was the transgender issue, which kind of played the role of gay marriage, that was big for those of us who remember that, of the George Bush John Kerry race, they kind of demonized that gay marriage was going to end civilization as we know it. They played that card on the transgender issue, and they played it especially on the immigration issue. And this idea, again, of the other, to the degree to which, if you believe people voted against their economic interests, well, then they were voting for cultural issues. And Trump and his campaign were masters at pushing those buttons.
Look, I think it's as simple as this. There were not Haitian people eating dogs. And that was disgusting. The way that came up with multiple speakers, actually, much later at the Madison Square Garden rally, which I watched the whole thing because we were covering it at the city, was racist in the simplest sense of the term, non-controversially. It was saying this whole group of people is like that and has these appalling traits. But J.D. Vance talked at one point about how he was filling in the narrative gap. And there were all these questions. Any tabloid reader here looking at the Post of the Daily News knows, well, there are all these migrants here. There's stuff happening in Midtown. It's a little chaotic. Is there crime happening? Yes. And then there's cops on background saying this is coming from the migrants. How much? We don't know. This is an answerable thing. And the city and the Democratic establishment writ large has tried to avoid a lot of those answers. And the result is that you have people who are very reasonably outraged by a comedian talking about an island of garbage and saying, by the way, a ton of other nasty things. He had a watermelon joke about black people. He had a whole bunch of them. It was appalling. But it turns out the people were more upset that there are lots and lots of people coming. This is very expensive. We haven't quite signed on for this, and this includes in places like New York City. Then that rhetoric is out of hand when they were looking at what the larger problem was. And I think Democrats have to come to a serious reckoning with that, that if these people are so fascist, so racist, so terrible, like, what is your positive, affirmative agenda? And I do think Bernie Sanders has rhetorically offered a model for some of that. And there's some limits I could point to. Biden actually picked up a lot of his agenda. They had a sort of pocket deal, which is why he had a lot of support from the closer to socialists in Washington. And they stayed supportive of him, including when people were talking about how ridiculously old he seemed and how problematic that was after the debate. But it turned out that a lot of the country was saying, this larger thing is happening. You don't have to love Trump. You don't even have to love the Republicans. Those people kept showing up, and a lot of ambivalent Democrats about that, sometimes about the transgender issue. And by the way, in 1996, this is what the angry conservatives said was coming broadly. And again, they did it in obscene terms and sort of rhetorically. But you start off with letting these people marry, right? And then next thing you know, you're going to have thruples, and people are going to be marrying their pets. And they were saying all of this weird and gross stuff. But lots of people who, I know some of them, who are like actual Republicans, who in their own personal lives are perfectly decent to people who are transgender or have other roles, but are like very angry about being told how to talk about that, about having this treated as like the civil rights issue of our day when you're talking about a very small population. They all showed up. And a lot of Democrats who felt uncomfortable and coerced decided to stay home. And really, like, if the stakes are as high as I think they are, and as Democrats frame them as being, having some affirmative argument that you can convince people of and get them to turn out to vote is utterly important. And this election was when the no, not this guy, we're not that, turned out not to be enough. And there's a reckoning due now.
Another thing about Kamala Harris is her gender. I believe in 2016, we didn't elect Trump so much as people threw out Hillary. They were sick and tired of Hillary and the Clintons and all the drama around. And in 2020, people threw out Trump more than they elected Joe Biden. And this year, with Trump coming back, and admittedly this very strange way that Kamala Harris became the nominee with Biden dropping out, how important was gender? I mean, are there people who simply won't vote for a woman?
Oh,
let alone the fact that she's black and Indian.
There are absolutely people who just won't vote for a woman. There are a lot of people who, well, the evangelical community doesn't even want, for the most part, women to keep the right to vote. There's a movement now to repeal the 19th Amendment within the Christian nationalist / evangelical movement. So yes, there's that to begin with. Then there are the people who just don't want to vote for a woman or for a black woman, or who, we heard this again and again, I don't know much about her. I don't know really very much about her. And that sounded absurd to some of us because we're all very tuned in and political, but vice presidents are all but invisible to the public. And she was a very quiet vice president. So they really didn't know her. The things that they picked at about her were gender related, a lot of them. The laugh, the making fun of various other things about her like that. But I think that this was, I don't think people think that they voted against their economic self-interests. I think that they voted for them. And you're hearing stories now, like people who were going to get a bonus because the company had record profits, but they're now not going to get a bonus because the company's taking all their money and putting it into buying the inventory quick before tariffs come in so that they can use the price rise that they're going to put in right away on the non-tariffed goods to pay for the tariffed goods. People believed that the tariffs are paid for by the countries who were exporting to us from whom we were importing the goods. And you couldn't convince them that this wasn't true. This was an election where you couldn't convince a lot of people that things weren't true. I spoke to Democrats who, some of them relatively sophisticated Democrats, who kept on asking me, but isn't it true that? And it would be, there must be something to it if we keep hearing about Springfield, Ohio. There must be something to it if we keep hearing about sex changes of your small child during the school day from the nurse that doesn't even have the permission to give an aspirin. People weren't looking at things through any kind of common sense lens. It was a very emotional election. It was a change election. In the same way that you were just saying that the other elections were change elections, so was this one. This didn't work for me.
I want to spend a little bit of time in this cultural question. I do want to get to what it means for New York. I do want, I think that's a very important part of this discussion. But in particular, Sarah, when you and I grew up in New York, there were 7 English language daily newspapers. There, there were, plus you had a couple of papers on Long Island. You had the Yiddish papers, the Russian papers, the Italian papers, the Spanish papers, the Polish papers. They were across a broad ideological spectrum, but they all agreed on the same facts. Same with 3 major networks. They all agreed on the same facts, and then they argued over them. With the technological revolution, people like one of the guys who funded the city, who basically created a list that destroyed classified ad pages, which are the most lucrative pages. All of a sudden, the entire economic model of journalism changes, and the technological revolution hollowed out the middle, made people recede to their ideological silos, and there is no middle ground. We don't agree on facts that we can argue about, which is what gets to this cultural versus economic argument.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would say absolutely the role of disinformation and the general mean-spiritedness of the Trump campaign go hand in hand in sowing a lot of confusion. And I think that absolutely accounts for some amount of how we should understand this election. But I want to return to the point that, again, Trump didn't significantly gain ground. Harris lost significant ground, and the question has to remain, why did, whatever the final number is going to be, 10 or so million people who voted for Biden not show up and vote for Harris? And we can say, and again, I think economists and Democratic strategists and experts and consultants are going to point to the objective, what they perceive to be the objective economic record, and puzzle over why it is that 10 million working class people and 10 million former Democratic voters didn't turn out. I think what we're ignoring is the lived reality of a lot of people in this country. Rent is burdensome for so many people. Interest rates are it's far too damn high. Interest rates have made buying a house even more difficult for generational cohorts that were already having a hard time buying it. It is the case that despite the fact that the Federal Reserve's monthly measure of inflation has receded, you go to the grocery store and things are expensive, and this stuff hurts people on limited budgets. And it's not all that confusing, I think, when we look at it that way. You look at data right now, the lowest income groups are the ones who feel the most likely that their jobs are at risk over the next 6 to 12 months. People are, in a way, grappling with an emotional relationship to the economy that I think parallels in a vague way the 1970s, of uncertainty about their futures in their jobs and a lot of anxiety about the cost of living. And that's a really toxic brew for an incumbent party. And it's, I suspect, why the Democrats' fortunes were similar to those of most incumbent parties around the world, with the exception, of course, of Morena in Mexico, which is led by a populist left party and leadership that has spent years building a mass base, doing popular education around economic issues. And I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from them.
In the 1970s, of course, one big difference was the oil boycotts and and gas prices went through the roof. They did go high, but they were, nothing relative. I want to come back to you again on this cultural question. Were you surprised? I mean, I assume you were surprised that the Latino returns shifting so much for Trump. And, an understanding that Latino is a very broad term that includes, Puerto Ricans for whom immigration is not an issue. It includes Mexicans, Salvadorans, Venezuelans, Cubans. I mean, it's a very diverse group. So, we should be careful about overarching generalizations. But, what drove people, even in the face of immigration arguments, which I would argue were explicitly, as close to explicitly anti-Latino as you could have gotten, to vote for Trump?
This is the thing. When you check the statistics about who voted for Trump and for Kamala, what you see is that Latinos still voted for Kamala. Mm-hmm. Puerto Ricans, 55%. Mexicans went to 60%. Those numbers are a little bit less than before.
They're significantly less than before, I think.
Well,
I may be wrong.
Yeah, I think that we are getting a bad rap about this because if you have a message for Latinos in general, that's not a message specifically for Dominicans, Mexicans, and Puerto Ricans. It's a general message. And I think that they grouped all of us under one umbrella.
In one lump.
And they had one message that they thought, according to whatever studies and research that they did, that it was the right message, instead of bothering in putting more effort in creating a message for each one of the different groups. Mexicans, they come from Mexico and they are not citizens. Puerto Ricans are born with citizenship. So you can see some differences in the way in which we see the society itself. But Mexicans voted a little bit more because they are the ones that are basically under the boot of the Republican Party, and they're the ones who wants to. Puerto Ricans didn't have that issue. But that has always existed.
Yes.
And in the past, those numbers were always almost the same. And then I wonder how the Puerto Rican vote would have voted without the joke in Madison Square Garden. I think that I'm Puerto Rican, I think that we will always have followed the long history of voting Democratic. It's a long history. We have never voted anything in any other way than under the Democratic Party. 54%, I still think that is between the 60 and the 50, and I think that is a good number. I think that we're getting a bad rap about it. And sometimes we're looking for scapegoats about things.
No, I mean, well, I think you say looking for scapegoats. I think that the Monday morning quarterback and the backing and the navel gazing, a lot of people are trying to find somebody to blame, which is why I really think ultimately this was a cultural wave, and it was her gender and her people somewhat uncomfortable with, with the fact that she was, black and Indian. I think that you can analyze every individual group, and it's not going to get you to the answer. Let me shift, just because I don't want to lose this point. Is you can see Trump beginning to form his cabinet, and you see Lee Zeldin is being named to be the Environmental Protection Administrator for a government that wants to strip a lot of regulation, wants to pump up the oil industry. You see the Homeland Security people who are going to literally calling for organizing camps and mass deportation, which is a profoundly disturbing issue in this city. Anti-regulation in all kinds of, in the Federal Trade Commission, and people who are trying to control an out of kind of a rapacious capitalist economy, if you will. What does this mean for New York? I don't know, anybody wants to jump in. What does this mean for us?
I think that it makes us sort of an island in the country where our own lives and our government are going to be different and in opposition to a lot of the rest of the country. We are not going to be able to control the removal of migrants from New York City. I think that it's possible that part of the strategy, the whole overarching strategy here, was all of those busloads of migrants that came from the southern border and were brought into New York and some other northern cities, but specifically we're talking about New York here. I think that that was partly to say, screw you, New York, this is what you think
Yeah, I
you
think
want.
it was largely. Yeah.
But it was also to say, let's see how you like it when we dump all these people on you and we drain your coffers and you see them wandering the subways with babies strapped to their backs. You're not going to like this. We're doing this to you on purpose. And I think it had its intended effect. I think that people were shocked by what happened and shocked. We've always had a homeless population, but they were, our homeless. We did not have the kind of mass arrival of people who had nowhere to go and had to be put up in tents in airfields. So when you look at what happened in New York and the areas of New York that have turned light red to dark red all over the southern part of Brooklyn, the eastern part of Queens, and the Bronx, that's where a lot of that came from. There was some of it bubbling up before, but it pushed it way over the edge there. And I think that we're going to have our own problems in next year's election, which isn't our topic, but I think we're going to have that as a spillover effect from this election.
In our municipal.
In our municipal elections, yeah.
When people are anxious and insecure about their own lives, they are liable to respond to the most dangerous kind of scapegoating, and that's not a new observation. That's what we've seen over time. We saw it in 2016. We saw it again today. That said, I don't think that, and I have to believe, and I'm not ready to move away from the belief that most people in this country are not diabolical. Most people don't want to see.
Well, not irredeemably racist.
Yeah, and most people don't want to see doors getting kicked down and neighbors getting dragged out of their homes. And I really do believe that when the reality of what this administration wants to do becomes clear, we will see a response. It's true that at the state and city levels, we have limited capacity to resist it, but that doesn't mean that there can't be a popular opposition, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see the Trump administration reaching too far and provoking a more solidaristic response across groups, not just immigrants.
This economy can't run without undocumented immigrants. And, let alone their role in industrial work in the Midwest and in farm work. But, we all know this every day, the economic power that undocumented people bring to this city because of the irrationality of the immigration system. Can this economy even work without undocumented people?
We may get closer to finding out soon. I would just note that having a semi-permanent underclass, and it's the farm workers upstate as like a very strong example, but it's the delivery people here who are exploited by the tech oligarchs, which is actually very different from undocumented people traditionally working as a delivery guy for this restaurant or in this kitchen, as opposed to being a gig worker who doesn't actually work for Uber or whatever, but is getting paid through someone else's social security number there. Like, this whole setup is morally obscene, and it's something that Congress has had the power to deal with and has failed for most of my lifetime now.
Yes.
We were very close to a deal. Trump derailed that because he said it wouldn't politically benefit him. But then he's offered, I think, an atrocious but a queer solution just as a simple selling point, like, we're going to have way less of these people, this isn't okay. And we just had nearly 4 years of a Democratic administration after ousting Trump, where Biden said, I'm going to fix this. We're not going to have kids in cages. We're not going to do these morally obscene things. But a big part of that was just no one can kick out the people who are seeking asylum. That's sort of outside the scope of what presently seems possible. A lot of those claims are not super serious. A lot of them are. But it's years to see a judge and have any finding about that. And they're not exactly judges, they're actually administrative judges, they're part of the executive branch. And that matters because it means any president, is serious about this, and Biden, it turns out, wasn't, in my view, and maybe Trump will be, like, my God, but like, you bring in many more judges, you work this out quickly, you don't put people into a lingering thing where they are the underclass for the next 5 years or whatever. And maybe the families are staying in hotels in New York, and the guys, like the women and children, and the guys, when people are coming in family units, are going elsewhere to find work and support their families. Like, it's a really screwed up circumstance, and I do think there's a lot of people of goodwill, including like Republicans and Trump voters who I don't always share values with, and sometimes don't generally, who are like, this isn't right, somebody should figure out something to fix this. And I think Democrats need to demonstrate in cities and nationally when they can what their answers are, and significantly that these work. It's easier when you're running against something than when you actually have to govern, and that's the challenge going forward in this city, and we'll see how this plays out in next year's election.
Tell us your name and your campus.
Ruby Bastola, John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And my question is, how do you think the recent election and the new Republican president's mass deportation plan will impact NYC, especially with the city's status as a sanctuary? How prepared is NYC to address the fears of its immigrant communities?
How about, the question is, how independent can we be in the face of a national wave? I mean, you started to talk about it, but can we resist?
That's a tough question. Right now, just going a little bit beyond the question, we have someone that is going to, already was appointed by Trump, that is going to be the czar of the border.
The border, Mr. Homan, the author of Project 2025.
Yeah, who is, exactly, and who is one of the most conservative people in the Republican Party. Then you have the appointment of Steve Miller as Chief of Staff.
Deputy Chief of Staff.
Deputy Chief of Staff of Policy for the White House. Also, who was a writer of of Project 2025. They have no problems in taking people over the fence. Personally, I'm Puerto Rican. I was born with citizenship.
Right.
In the island, I was citizen of the United States. Long story for that. I am afraid, and I have shared this with my family, that I cannot go to visit the South if I have to go to a conference, whatever. I'd rather not, because I'm brown and I have an accent. This is a very intrinsic thing. It's something that affects me personally and affects hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Latin Americans who happen to be citizens of the United States. That fear, I always tell my students, policy creates trauma. It's not your mother, it's policy. Just messing with Freud a little bit. And this is what policy does. I have spoken and I wrote about the Supreme Court of the United States with slavery and other decisions that they have made since the 19th century, 18th century, that have created trauma on people. So this goes beyond being deported. It's living here with fear and trauma because of those policies of discrimination. And we believe, I have to believe what they're saying. It's like Maya Angelou said, if they tell you who they are,
believe them.
Believe them. And that's where we are. There is no other alternatives. We have to go through this next 4 years, and they know that there is a possibility that they may lose that election in 4 years. So they're going to try to do the best they can to throw people literally over the fence. One of the things that Project 2025 implies is that citizens in the border will have the power to do the deportation themselves.
They also talk about the power to deport the American citizen children of undocumented, immigrants because they're going against, they're targeting birthright citizenship, which is that if you're born in this country, whatever the status of your parents, you are
and the Alien
a
Act,
citizen at birth.
The Alien Act, let me just finish with this. The Alien Act from the 19th century.
No, it's from the 18th
18th century.
1797.
1797. The Alien Act. That's the famous Korematsu case. Korematsu was a Japanese that he was interned and he went to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court said, no, the act is the law of the land. We have the right.
That was the Japanese internment in World War II case.
But it's based on that. Right. And what it says is basically that descendants, not talking about people who cross the border, descendants of a country who is in a war with the United States, they can be put in, that's how the internmentship was. But this is the thing. What are we going to do now? Because what they're saying, the new chief of staff of policy, Miller, said that gangs of color can be interpreted under the act as being descendants of a country that is in war with the United States, even when there is no country in war with the United States, but because they are descendants and they are gangs and they are creating violence in the United States, you can adapt the act to people of color.
Tell us your name and your campus, please.
Hi, my name is Lee Shaheen. I'm from Hunter campus, and my question is, how will a second Trump administration impact the bureaucratic state, specifically in regards to education?
Well, that's a very good question because there is, among the things they're talking about is doing away with the education department, which, among other things, establishes educational standards. So I don't know if you want to jump in on that or anything. Go ahead.
It's not just the educational standards, which they don't want educational standards. They want education to be a matter for parents to decide completely. But more than that, all over the country, there are people who get services through the Department of Education. They get speech services, they get special ed services, all of that, transportation to school, all of that. If they shut down the Department of Education, it's going to disappear. And I have heard some of the more extreme Republican architects of policy here talk about how we shouldn't even be educating special needs students, that it's a waste of time and resources. So I think that the effect on education in this country is going to be enormous.
Can I,
yes, please.
Go for it.
So very quickly, those last two questions sort of tied together. So all that being a sanctuary city means is that the authorities here do not cooperate with the federal authorities in certain specific circumstances. That's it. Ultimately, the federal government has supremacy over immigration policy and has law enforcement authority here, whether or not the locals want to cooperate. So it's a term that gets used a lot and is ill-defined, and we're clearly going to be testing some of those boundaries based on the rhetoric from the incoming administration and also this mayor. On the other end, the same administration that wants that power rising up to the federal level and for that to dominate wants to return education to the states, and so the states with very different starting points. There's a whole thing about the 10 Commandments in school, and like Louisiana and all that.
But actually,
do different things.
I want to get another question in, but in terms of, that was the same argument on abortion. We want to return it to the states, and now you see a distinct national abortion ban movement. So, I mean, it's, it really is somewhat of a duplicitous argument. Like,
Yep.
Yes, please.
Can I just jump in on this too? I mean, the two questions relate, I think, in another way as well, which is that, and to start with the second one, it is not just that the Trump administration, the Republican Party, wants to dismantle the Department of Education. They want to dismantle the entire what's called administrative state, which is to say every agency that has been erected over the last century or more to advance, whether it's environmental regulation, labor regulation, health regulation, financial regulation, all of that. And they've been mounting a war on the so-called administrative state
They won it
through
with
the
the
Chevron
courts,
decision.
they landed a major victory in the courts last year. So now between the courts and the administration, they've got a two-front, train going towards the administrative state. We should just be clear, what this thing that we call the administrative state is, again, a regulatory regime that was won through popular and progressive struggle through the polls and through workplace actions and community fights over a century to protect people from the rapaciousness of an unregulated economy. Yep. And what this government wants to do is dismantle every shred of social protection that working people have won over the last century. They also want to dismantle every right that immigrant communities have. And look, the bottom line is that we have very limited capacity through our institutions at the city and state level to protect ourselves from this. This is just the fact. The federal government has a lot of power over us right now. But we didn't win these things through city and state officials fighting for us. These were won through strikes. These are won through organizing. And that's what it's going to take, again, to not only protect them, but to rebuild them out of the ashes of whatever we come out of a few years from now.
Yes, please. I want to get a couple of more questions.
My name is Diletta Scaglione, and I'm from BMCC. Here is my question. Trump is part of a wave of populism that is affecting Europe as well, where we are awarding the strong man, and the narrative is that the left is woke and intellectual and is detached from reality of everyday Americans, like we said. How would you say state officials can contribute to fight this narrative and communicate to the working class that small government, like we just said, and the dismantlement of several agencies like public health and education departments will make them worse off?
Another way to look at the fact that you have this kind of the Viktor Orbáns of Hungary, and you have all these kind of ascendant authoritarians. It's also a fact that even left-leaning parties, like in France, have been, I'm not totally sure it's ideological as it is anti-incumbent across a broad array, but is that, is this an international movement? I see that, we see the Trump affinity for Putin, that, arguably a lot of Ukrainians are going to die because of this.
I think that there's a lot of propaganda being fed through the kind of channels that we only have developed over the last 10 years or so.
Because of that,
split.
Ideological silos.
Yeah. And the silos have given the opportunity for other countries and other people who are strongmen in their countries. It's given them the opportunity to feed propaganda into the Western world in a way that's been incredibly effective and is entirely stealth.
Yeah, because you look, Argentina went from the left to the right, Brazil went from the right to the left. So, there's I'm not convinced it's ideological so much as throw the bums out. But I do think that the question does touch on the kind of right-wing authoritarianism that's clearly ascendant. And this is where we are, too. We have about 6 minutes left. Let me get one more question in, ma'am. Tell us your name and your campus.
Hi, my name is Kim Flores, and I'm from York College. My question is, this is for our current U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris. She promised a lot of things. She became president of the United States, for example, bring down costs on food and groceries, which, by the way, is spiking at the moment. Pretty scary. However, did this stop the people of America to vote due to not being able to make that promise at this moment? Because she's already the vice president.
Go ahead.
So, in brief, Kamala Harris had been in the Senate for less than one full term. She had 0 signature accomplishments in the Senate. She was a very accomplished politician in California. She moved up very quickly in a new model that Obama started and Trump then advanced, in which you want to move really fast before you actually have a record to drag you down. And against Donald Trump, which helps, who, when he first ran, was sort of a ridiculous figure who had no business being there in the first place.
Which is why I believe they threw out Hillary instead of electing Trump.
So in addition to the questions of identity, and people don't want to vote for a woman, a black candidate, any of the rest of that, you have this actually sort of clear threshold where you have a avatar for a center that isn't holding, where people do not feel great about their own conditions, rightly or wrongly, who has almost no record to check her against or to understand, and is just saying, how are you going to be different from Biden? I don't know. There's not a specific thing I could say, but you can trust my values. I'll be my own person, whatever that means. You get to find out later. And that turned out not to be a successful appeal. It wasn't one that connected to people's sense of their economic interests, right or wrong. And I think that was very frustrating. I would have liked to have heard someone talking about the dangers of dismantling the administrative state and how you don't want your kids having poison in their food, and having an end to the work week before people drop dead from it are obvious and healthy things. And we did not have that conversation. And we had somebody running saying, this is good enough, consider the alternative. And I think we got a verdict on that there were enough people who were upset, who did turn out, and enough people who thought about how things are and said, maybe not this year. And this is where the country's at. And I'm hoping the Democratic Party in a two-party system could start figuring this out. But it's awfully late and dispiriting.
Let me get one more question, and thank you. Name and campus, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Joel Hernandez. I am currently a student at BMCC. My question is, with this new administration rolling in, and they've tagged higher education as a leftist ideology, how do you see higher education developing and in the interest for students?
This is, maybe the best example is what happened in Florida, where Governor DeSantis, effectively neutered and, largely destroyed the independence of the Florida State University system. And that is kind of a model. I mean, you're in academia, sir.
It's a great question, and it's a good one for us to, bring things all together here at the City University of New York. It's important, for one, to recognize the real threat that higher education and public higher education in particular faces right now. It's an existential threat, and we shouldn't take it lightly. At the same time, and this goes for how we understand this entire moment, a historical perspective is useful. Higher education and public higher education have been under attack for a long time. This university used to be free.
When I went there, it was
When I went
free.
there too.
Public higher education all over the country used to be much more affordable. State allocations, that's to say out of tax revenues, what state governments were putting into higher education were significantly more than what students were paying in tuition. That over the last 30 or 40 years has flipped in just about every single state. So the war on higher education has been waged for a long time, and it's absolutely going to accelerate right now. But we should be clear, and that's an example that illustrates something broader, which is that this administration, while they are new in many ways, also represents continuity from where we've been over the last 50 years of attacks on working people, attacks on the public sector, attacks on the very idea that there is such a thing as a public that we all share in. And that and the failure of the Democratic Party to respond to those attacks, and frankly, the Democratic Party complicity in those attacks, explains a lot of why so many people are shrugging their shoulders and not turning out. And if the Democratic Party is ever going to win back power, that's something that we have to reckon with.
You're the other academic on the panel.
I wish I was. Well, the thing is that traditionally the stereotype is that educators, especially in social science, humanities, etc., not so much in the other science that have to do with chemistry, etc., have always been stereotyped as liberals and liberals and leftists. I teach at the School of Social Work, and that's what the other students who are not at the School of Social Work look at me like a liberal. And it's true. We're a bunch of liberals at the School of Social Work. But the academia, the texts that we use go back to a couple of centuries back, not only in social work, in philosophy, in economy. Are you going to call those people leftists? No. They were academics, and that was it.
No,
they,
but no,
they,
but
they,
they-
they didn't
right.
have a stamp on them of whether they were for the left or the right. They were doing academic work 100%, and that was what it was taught. I don't think that we have changed that we have changed dramatically, that trying to poison the minds of the students to make them leftists or liberals. We just teach it like it has always been taught. But I think that that's a way of basically making sure that we diminish and we debilitate and we weaken the liberal type of education that has always existed.
That's precisely what's under attack.
To make an opening for a more conservative type of teaching in the United States, because that's exactly what Project 2025, if you read it, that's exactly the plan.
I'm running out of time here. I always try to make deadline. Thank you all. We'll see you next time on CUNY Forum. Unfortunately, this discussion will continue. Thank you.